I'm Jim Pinkerton.
I'm Michael Lind.
And welcome to Blogging Heads TV, or as we're going to call it for this session, Flogging Heads TV, because the subject is Michael Lind's book, The American Way of Strategy, which, although it is a weighty tome full of history and erudition, is also extremely relevant to our current debate on foreign policy and the American way of life. And so as we go through the course of this hour on Blogging Heads TV, I think Mike will be more than able to demonstrate that. But Mike, if I could begin. What is the American way of strategy?
Well, I wrote The American Way of Strategy to defend what I think is the mainstream tradition of American internationalism that coalesced in the first half of the 20th century and underpins a lot of our strategy up until the end of the Cold War. This is not my theory. This is not Michael Lind's theory of the world. This is not some kind of academic theory I'm promoting. I've tried to excavate an existing tradition that was you can trace back to Theodore Roosevelt, to Franklin Roosevelt, to Woodrow Wilson and his advisors, Secretary of State Robert Lansing, journalists like Walter Lippmann. And to sum up very quickly, the book explains what Woodrow Wilson meant when he said that the U.S. and its allies must make the world safe for democracy. Wilson did not say that the U.S. and its allies must make the world democratic, but safe for democracy. And I explain what that means.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I have, in Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, if I remember correctly, the word democracy doesn't appear. He talks about national self-determination, but not democracy. So you say this, so what did President Wilson have in mind then, as you articulated?
Well, what is a world safe for democracy? It's one in which the security costs imposed on the United States by the outside world are sufficiently low that the U.S. can afford to have a liberal, democratic, republican system with separation of powers, with the civilian economy, and so on. It was the fear, both in World War I and in World War II in the years preceding, and also in the late 1940s and 1950s, that if Germany or the Soviet Union were allowed to become the dominant superpower in the world and to encircle us in the oceans and in the Western Hemisphere, we Americans would give up much of our liberty and much of our democracy voluntarily. That is, we were in no danger of being conquered by the Germans, and the Russians weren't going to occupy Minnesota or Kansas. What the Wilson administration and the interventionists in World War I and Franklin Roosevelt and the Cold War interventionists feared was, and they said this explicitly, I quote it in my book, it's seldom quoted nowadays, but this was the major argument for intervention in the World Wars and the Cold War. The fear was that the U.S. would have to become a garrison state voluntarily. That is, we would voluntarily cede a lot of our liberty to the government to be secure. We would voluntarily have enormous levels of defense spending in a world in which the dominant superpower were Germany or the Soviet Union. So when politicians say that we intervened in the World Wars and the Cold War to defend our liberty at home, I argue they're quite right. But what they need to say is to defend our liberty from our own government, which we would reluctantly but voluntarily turn into something of a militarized police state if we had to create a Fortress America. And it was in order to avoid creating a Fortress America that we nipped this trouble in the bud. We never allowed Germany to consolidate its would-be European empire in its two attempts at conquering Europe. And we never allowed the Soviet Union to intimidate Western Europe and Japan into submission and to divide them from the U.S. And I think that's something that needs to be explained, because otherwise if you say American soldiers have fought and died abroad defending our liberty, that just seems like cheap rhetoric if you think, well, come on. I mean, really, the Kaiser wasn't going to, conquer the United States, and the Soviets weren't going to invade California.
So you're saying that President Wilson and President Roosevelt and Eisenhower and others were defending freedom here at home by pushing the fight, as it were, to places overseas, and that might...
Yeah, they say this explicitly. For example, in 1919, when Woodrow Wilson is touring the country, arguing for U.S. participation in the League of Nations, as one of a number of great powers who would have this collective security system, he argued that if the League failed, if you had recurrent rounds of World War every 10 or 20 years, then the U.S. would have to have all male adults would have to belong to a standing army. the president would have to be a kind of permanent military commander. You would have to suppress civil liberties. Now, today neoconservative, presidential candidates could run on this platform and they would think this is appealing. This horrified Wilson, and this was Woodrow Wilson, who had presided over massive repression of civil liberties, draft economy, all of that during World War I. And he feared that if this happened again and again, every generation, that would be the end of the American Republic. And then if you skip ahead to NSC 68, which is the Truman administration, a national security document that set out the strategy of containment, it begins by saying that if the Soviet Union were allowed to mobilize the resources of Eurasia and the U.S. were put on the defensive, we would have to devote great resources to the military far beyond anything that we actually devoted in the Cold War on a permanent basis. And we would have to have a regimented system so that, now if you're a cynic, you could say, well, this is sort of propaganda. It's like Stalin saying you have to have socialism in one country before you spread it in the world. On the basis of my research, I think that they were quite sincere. They thought it's better to spend 6 or 10 or 15% of our GDP, let's say in the Cold War, to prevent the Soviet Union from ever getting anywhere near global hegemony than to wait and have to create a fortress America in a world in which the dominant power was somebody else.
Well, there's two observations lead to mind, and I'll let you answer both of them. First, on the left, people will say we already have a garrison warfare state. And the neoconservatives, who you alluded to earlier, would say, well, gosh, Mr. Lin, you've often been seen as a critic of the neoconservatives, but it sounds to me, this is me as a neoconservative here, saying you agree with us completely, because President George W. Bush, has been saying all along, forward strategy for freedom, take the fight to Iraq, so we don't have to fight them in the streets of Iowa. But let's do those in sequence. Let's back to the left. Some would say we already have, in fact, created a militarized garrison state.
Yeah, that's absurd. It's absurd if you look at the actual statistics. U.S. military spending as a percentage of GDP was around 6% for most of the Cold War. It spiked up over 10% in Korea, and then a much lesser level in Vietnam. It went down to about 3% under Clinton, which was slightly more than the amount that France at that point in the late 90s was spending. France was around 2.8. So our defense spending, there was a huge peace dividend. We really did slash our military spending in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. Now, the Bush administration following 9/11 has pushed it up officially to a little more than 4%, but if you have all these black programs and off-budget things, it may be up to 5 or 6%, which is near the Cold War average. But it's very far from being a militarized garrison state. If you look at the Soviet Union, it's now thought that in the 70s and 80s it was spending between a quarter and a third of its GDP on the military. So it's simply not true. And there's this kind of Gore Vidal, left-wing conspiracy theory about how the sinister Harry Truman invented the Cold War as an excuse for the military-industrial complex, to become this vast imperial apparatus. If you look, as I have done, at military planning in the 1940s, during World War II, and in the years immediately following World War II, the maximum that the armed services thought they could get was a fraction of what we do today. For example, the Air Force wanted to have a few island bases off of the Pacific shore of Asia, so that long-range bombers, could attack any superpower in the future. They were as much worried about a revived Japan and Germany at that point as they were about the Soviet Union. No one in the Roosevelt administration or in the early Truman years thought that the American people and Congress would put up with any permanent overseas military bases. That was a result of the Korean War. But again, there was no master plan. For this. It was a response to Soviet aggression. The Soviets, while the U.S. rapidly demobilized its military, following a victory in Europe, the Soviets kept their 14, 15 million man Red Army in Europe, and then they used it while they gradually wiped out one independent government in half of Europe after another. And so this old, it's kind of radical left theory, that it was, big business or the defense contractors invented the Cold War. It seems to me that's been totally discredited by history, particularly by the way the Cold War ended. The Cold War started when the Red Army refused to leave Europe. and refused to allow free elections. The Cold War ended when the Red Army left Europe and when it allowed free elections.
For some of you out there in Blogging Heads TV, it's Lind, L-I-N-D, @newamerica.net. But let's now hear what you have to say about the neoconservatives, because as just to repeat the argument, it seems if you're talking about a forward strategy of freedom, you're talking about fighting in Okinawa or Arnhem to oppose fascism and tyranny, then what's wrong with the Bush argument that we're fighting a new kind of tyranny and fascism in Afghanistan and Iraq and possibly elsewhere?
Well, there are two problems with it. To begin with, what's the enemy? I mean, is it the jihadist movement? The jihadist movement, now that they've lost their state sponsor in Afghanistan, it's kind of like the anarchists in the 1900s, or maybe a better example would be, the communists before they came to power in Russia in 1917, back when Stalin was a bank robber, and Lenin was living in exile. Now, it is in the interest of the U.S. and of civilization in general to make sure these people don't take over any government, because then they'd be far more of a threat than they are. Even they're a threat now with mass casualty terrorism, but they'd be much a greater threat if they had a sovereign state and a military and a police, and an arsenal. But the purpose of our Pentagon spending clearly is not to defeat the jihadists. Most of them are scattered, from parts of Pakistan, to hideouts in Europe. It's primarily a matter, the neocons don't like people saying this, but it's primarily a matter of law enforcement and of intelligence. It's not primarily a military matter. So if you look at the actual weapon systems we're buying in our Navy and our Air Force and our Army, it's not to, go after terrorists living in apartments in Hamburg and in, parts of London, nor is it really to go after so-called rogue states like Iran and North Korea, which you could check with a far less expensive, less developed military. It's to provide permanent U.S. imperial protection of East Asia and of Europe and of the Middle East. And the rationale for this was set forth by the defense planning guidance documents in the first Bush administration and by George Bush's national security strategy. Neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz and others have been quite clear about this. The purpose is to prevent any of the other great powers, particularly Japan and Germany, our allies, as well as, strategic rivals like China and Russia, from daring to challenge us. So there's essentially two strategies involved here. One is we reassure our Cold War allies, like Germany and Japan, where during the Cold War, for obvious reasons, because they were defeated powers, we took over the burden of defending them against the Soviets and against Mao's China. The neoconservatives want Japan and Germany to be permanently subordinate satellites to the United States, and the American taxpayer and American soldiers will protect them from now on, because the fear is otherwise there will once again be a powerful Japanese military, a powerful independent German military. In the case of China and Japan, and Russia rather, they use the term dissuasion. That is, we will dissuade them from trying to compete with us as a pure competitor. That's their term for a rival superpower. So in the American way of strategy, I argue that our post-Cold War strategy, which has been agreed to some degree by most establishment Democrats as well as Republicans, is designed to convert the temporary alliance leadership of the United States during the Cold War into permanent U.S. Military hegemony in three regions outside of North America: East Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. The first two have industrial great powers, which if they converted their industrial power into military power, could challenge us. And the third, the Middle East, has a resource, obviously oil, critical to all industrial countries. That was not the goal of the two Roosevelts, of Wilson, and of others in the first half of the 20th century, in what I call the American internationalist tradition. Their goal was what they called a concert of power. That is, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, in their wildest dreams, never imagined that the United States by itself could dominate the world without bankrupting itself. What they sought was something equally expensive in some ways. It was a very active internationalist policy, but the U.S. would be chairman of the board of a directorate of great powers. For example, Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, he hoped that the wartime alliance of the U.S., Britain, the Soviet Union, and China, nationalist China, could be maintained. It was a different roster of great powers, in World War I, but the major powers would collaborate to enforce the peace and to prevent aggression. It was modeled on the concert of Europe in the 19th century.
So this was, in our parlance today, sort of multilateral is what they had in mind. Is that fair?
Yes, although I prefer to use terms like great power cartel, great power directorate, because multilateralism, it does sound sort of wimpy and nerdy, and this was hard power. I mean, this was a very tough-minded approach. So it's not a matter of UN General Assembly resolutions and things like that. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt had thought that the League of Nations had failed because it was too formal, too rigid, and what he wanted eventually, it's not what evolved, but he actually wanted the big four, the U.S., the Soviet Union, Britain, and Nationalist China, to be more or less outside of the system. That is, you'd have a formal bureaucratic United Nations, to which he gave the name United Nations. But this would be sort of an informal great power concert. Decisions would be made at meetings in neutral islands, that you would have these summits of the kind that he had with Churchill and Stalin. So what he actually had in mind was something closer to the G8, sort of an informal periodic gathering of the great powers. And Philip Bobbitt has suggested the idea, which I endorse, that if you want all of the great powers to participate in peacekeeping, international security today, the G8 is pretty much the list. You had China and India, and that pretty much is the world's leading military powers as well as the leading economic powers. And you don't have this problem of reforming the UN Security Council.
So you're better off just creating an ad hoc?
I think so. I think it may sound strange because most people who call themselves internationalists are very pro-UN, but I think the UN was doomed from the beginning, as the League of Nations was, because it is just too formal. It's just impossible to change the leadership to reflect the actual distribution of power in the world, as opposed to the great powers of 1945. And in fact, the UN was created while the League of Nations still existed. Did you know this? There was a brief overlap in time when some of the diehards of the League of Nations refused to grant any legitimacy to the UN. And finally, after a couple of years, they just sort of shut down the building, and that was it. So I think probably it would have been better if after the end of the Cold War we had sort of started from scratch and had a looser and more flexible system of great power cooperation. Now, of course, the neoconservatives have this very dark, pessimistic, kind of Spenglerian view of the world in which all great powers, inevitably will be at each other's throats.
Well, but the neoconservatives also say, to give them their due here, they would say, well, what Mr. Lind is, I think you've done, Mike, a pretty good job of distinguishing yourself from the left and from the neoconservatives, but the neoconservatives might extend their grip on you by saying that, well, your idea of the G8 is similar to our. And the Heritage Foundation, which is quite strictly speaking neocon, has pushed a Council of Democracies, some sort of plenum like that. Now, how is your idea, what you're talking about, different than the Krauthammer Heritage Foundation idea of some sort of, democracies? They get you.
Well, the advocates of a concert of democracies explicitly distinguish this idea from the idea of a concert of all great powers, whether they're democratic or not. Chiefly, the concert of democracies would leave out China. And according to some of its advocates, Russia too, which they consider not democratic at present. And their argument for it, I think, is somewhat disingenuous. Now, I hate to attribute motives to people, but the support for this idea that you find among neoconservatives and neoliberal, sort of hawkish Democrats, I think essentially the concert of democracies, excluding China and Russia, would really simply be America's existing alliance system in disguise. You would call it the concert of democracies. Maybe you would add the Costa Ricans, or the South Africans. But essentially it's NATO in Europe, and it's the U.S.-Japan, South Korea alliance in East Asia. So it's kind of a new label for existing U.S. hegemony. And it's very interesting that James Lindsay, in the latest issue of The American Interest, advocates this concert of democracy idea from a democratic perspective. And he's criticized and endorsed by various people who comment on it in that issue. But he argues that in a concert of power wouldn't work because China and Russia, the two putatively non-democratic powers, or actually non-democratic in the clear case of China, would not agree with the U.S. on various policies. Well, where has he been? with the democracies, for the past decade. I mean, the French and the Germans did not support us in Iraq. There are divisions within the democratic West over how to deal with Russia and China and Iran, just as there are between China and the U.S. on some of these issues.
Well, okay, but what would China, the U.S., and Russia agree on?
They would agree on peace and against regional aggressors and also against stateless terrorism that threatens everybody's interests. Now, again, this is fundamentally important because it's missed in most of the discussion of the American liberal internationalist tradition. Liberal internationalists, through most of the 20th century, thought that the goal of liberal internationalism was world peace. It wasn't universal democracy and it wasn't universal human rights. Those were long-term ultimate goals of human civilizational social evolution. They were not the goals of the League of Nations and of the United Nations in the short term. And people who had lived through 3 world wars, because the Cold War was the Third World War. The point of liberal internationalism is to avert this cycle of world wars. It's not to have a world war every generation. And now, what is the link between the absence of world wars and liberalism and democracy? Again, is the world would be safe for democracy. That is, all countries would not necessarily be liberal democracies. Maybe only a minority would be, but that minority would not be under pressure to militarize its economy, to shift power from the legislative branch to the executive branch. Even if it continued to have free elections, it could be illiberal, even if it were still an electoral democracy, for fear that it would get sucked into a new world war, even if it broke out somewhere else.
So, Mike, are you then a liberal internationalist? Did I hear you right?
Yes, I think that liberal internationalism properly defined is quite different from what goes by the name of liberal internationalism nowadays. Old-fashioned liberal internationalism did not believe in invading countries to impose liberal and democratic regimes on them. This is this is a new ideology, and they're trying to steal the name of liberal internationalism. The neoconservatives, at least, neoconservatism was an insult by Michael Harrington. That's how they got their title. But I think it's very important to distinguish genuine Roosevelt, Wilson, liberal internationalism from this kind of crusading democratism, or as I prefer to call it, democratic hegemonism, because the basic premise is that sovereignty would no longer be the basis of the international system. That is, the self-determination of sovereign states and non-intervention, which is the corollary that flows from it. Instead, you would have a 2-tier world, according to the concert of democracy theorists. Some states would be more sovereign than others. The only true members of the international system whose sovereignty would be respected would be liberal democracies. Non-democratic countries would have a part or all of their sovereignty stripped away. Democracies could invade them, even if they were not aggressive in terms of cross-border aggression, simply to change their social system, simply to change their form of government. And I think that's a disastrous perversion of the historic tradition of American liberal internationalism, which was in favor of encouraging liberalism and democracy, but by means other than military means. The purpose of military force in the liberal internationalist system that's embodied in the UN Charter was to defeat interstate cross-border aggression.
There's more a model of international law, I guess.
Exactly. Well, international law, that's right. International law, the United States sought, in the UN Charter and in other forms, to outlaw aggressive war. If you go back and you look at the Nuremberg trials, we think of the Nuremberg trials now in terms of genocide, and that was one of the counts against the Nazis. But one of the basic count of war crimes against the Nazis and against the Japanese military was waging aggressive war. And whether or not aggressive war was illegal before 1945, clearly, beginning with the UN Charter, it is.
Right. So you're sort of a Grotian, as in Hugo Grotius, going back ways to the founder of international law, who said, let's stop, in the spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia, let's stop invading people across borders just for the fun of it. And these are ancient roots. But let's go back a little bit on your book, because if you're a liberal internationalist, or I'm going to call you a Grotian from now on, there are lots of other theories about how America history has been evolved and how American foreign policy has evolved. probably the phrase that most people, especially if a somewhat critical vein, would use. They'd say, well, the real story about American history is its manifest destiny. That ever since the Pilgrims hacked their way across Massachusetts, we've been hacking our way across the continent, and the famous author John O'Sullivan, not to be confused with the contemporary author John O'Sullivan, the old John O'Sullivan back in like 1839 or something, coined the phrase, I believe. So when people talk breezily about, well, it's manifest destiny that we, go all the way to California and maybe conquer Mexico, and wherever else too, are they wrong?
Yes, essentially. You and I and everyone in our generation, going back, beginning in the 60s and 70s, the people who taught us American diplomatic history belonged to two camps, the radical left and realists. The radical left, at that time, they were sort of vaguely Marxist. They were a majority of the university faculty. Even if they were liberal, they were anti-Cold War, anti-communist. And so they tended to interpret all of American history in terms of the search by American capitalists, for the huge consumer markets of, Puerto Rico or, Mexican Arizona or something like that. It always seemed sort of absurd to me as a college student. And then on the other hand, you had the realists. These were disciples of Hans Morgenthau, of Nicholas Speakman, and other European emigres, who were chased out of Europe by Hitler, in the 30s and 40s. And so arriving on our shores, they announced rather haughtily that America had no rational foreign policy tradition before their arrival. And they were going to, the Herr Professor was going to share the wisdoms of European statecraft with the bumbling, incompetent, innocent Americans, power politics having done so much to help out Europe, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so they founded a school of realism, which is, I think of as the German school. I mean, it's dead in Germany. In Europe in 2007, you cannot find this kind of realpolitik. It's considered completely anachronistic. But it took root in the U.S. Academy. It didn't have that much influence on American foreign policy. But many professors and journalists have been influenced by this. So unlike the Marxist left, the realists did not attribute America's foreign policy from 1776 up until 1939 to the search for markets. They attribute it to, since they were Central Europeans, to Anglo-American lunacy. Basically, the Americans and also the English, from a Central European point of view, were just kind of strange, weird utopians. It was a result of Calvinism or liberalism or democratic republicanism.
Did the English do balance of power politics before anybody else?
Well, remember the English. Yes, they did balance of power sometimes, but also they were the great champions of a liberal international system before the U.S. because as a commercial power, they preferred to use the Grotian term. Grotius was Dutch, so there is a distinct Dutch-British American tradition, which prefers a open trading system, international, all of that. I mean, these are maritime trading powers, which many of these Central European emigres like Morgenthau and Kissinger just sort of found kind of primitive and backward and puzzling. So we got this story that, the War of 1812, well, in fact, that was never quite adequately explained when I was in school. And then supposedly the Mexican War was a result of manifest destiny. As you say, John O'Sullivan wrote an essay, and then all of these settlers just attacked Mexico, And then William Randolph Hearst, in order to boost the circulation of his newspapers, fabricated the Spanish-American War. And so it was essentially this very insulting, derisive view of American foreign policy history that said that it was motivated either by utopian idealism and messianism, or else by just naked capitalist profit motives. Now, if you read the history of American military policy, which I've done, and which I share with the readers of the American Way Strategy, and you also read what the presidents actually said to themselves and their diplomats and generals in things not intended for public consumption, Turns out that there were geopolitical reasons for all of these 19th century wars, other than getting land for Little House on the Prairie. I mean, that was sort of a secondary thing. Well, for example, the Mexican War. In the 1840s, Britain and France were both afraid that they would lose power in Asia to Russia and in the Western Hemisphere to the United States. They were afraid of these two growing powers. So they collaborated to try to restrain Russian power by jointly sacking China, for example, in the Opium Wars. And at the same time, in the 1840s, after the Republic of Texas, the Anglo-American settlers broke away from Mexico, Britain and France negotiated with Mexico, asking Mexico to recognize the independence of Texas as a republic in return for pressure on the Texans not to join the United States, because Britain and France wanted Texas to block the expansion of the United States. And at the same time, in the 1840s, the native Mexican elite in California had become more or less independent of Mexico. You know, Mexico was a failed state. It just constant coups. The central government had very little power. And so there was a debate among the Californios whether they should become a satellite of the British Empire or whether they should join the United States. And so if you look at the policy of the Polk administration, Polk had one concern in more or less provoking the war with Mexico. You know, in addition to annexing Texas, so that it wouldn't be this foreign country on the borders of the smaller United States, Polk wanted the two deep water ports of the West Coast, that is San Diego and San Francisco, which were essential for military reasons. You know, and he wanted to keep those out of the hands of the British. And then, if you look up to the purchase of Alaska by Seward, you know, in 1867. Russia did not want Alaska to fall into British hands because the British were trying to check Russian expansion in Asia at that time. And at the same time, the United States still considered Britain the major enemy. This changed later with the rise of Germany in the 1880s and 1890s. You know, there was geopolitics behind that. The Spanish-American War, you know, the same thing. You know, this wasn't brought about by William Randolph Hearst. It wasn't because a wave of irrational jingoism swept the United States. It's because the Spanish were losing their control over their Western European empire. And beginning in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm had a very aggressive policy of seeking bases in the Western Hemisphere to check American power, which he feared both in itself, but also he feared that the Americans might intervene in European power politics at some point in the future against Germany. So he sought bases in Mexico. He sought bases in the Caribbean. He hoped that Germany could take over the Philippines and Hawaii and Samoa. So we had this kind of naval Cold War, which you've never heard of. You know, which you know, the average textbook on U.S. Diplomacy, written either by left-wingers or by realists, doesn't even mention. But
because the realists were rooting for the Germans back then.
Well, it's also because the realists. I'll give the realists some credit. Since they concluded that everyone was a primitive idiot before they arrived here in the 1930s, there was no reason to go see what these ignoramuses had done, right? So they didn't even bother to do their research before dismissing, you know, the previous century of American foreign policy. We could skip back to the War of 1812. The War of 1812, France and its satellite, Spain, controlled Florida and much of what is now the Gulf Coast, you know, including cities like Mobile, you know, New Orleans. That was the U.S. was encircled. It was encircled on all sides, you know, and so it was a disastrous war. I think it was a terrible blunder. It led to Washington, D.C. being burned down by the British Navy. But it had a geopolitical motive, too. It wasn't just irrational messianism or, you know, manifest destiny or something like that. The goal was to take over Canada, and at the same time, you would take over Florida and the Gulf Coast. And so at one blow, you would remove the two greatest military powers in the world, Britain and France, from your borders.
Of course, I'm reminded, however, of what William McKinley, nobody was accused of being a realist or liberal. I don't know what he's been accused of, but mostly being sort of absent-minded. He said famously, you know, I woke up one day and discovered I had an empire. Well,
but this was, he told this to 3 Methodist ministers meeting him in the White House. You know, now, it is a problem that our presidents, to this day, generally don't think that they can tell the truth about American strategy to the American people. So what happens is they say, oh, I did it to Christianize the Filipinos or to bring the blessings of democracy, to the Mexicans in the 1840s, or for that matter, to bring the blessings of democracy to the Iraqi people, when what they were really after was filling a sphere of influence, denying a territory to a rival great power, or gaining key harbors, or bases.
Are American presidents on an ongoing basis for more than a century now? Are they lying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. When they come up with these kind of vague rationales, and the thing is, what they do is they inadvertently provide ammunition to the left and to the realists, because what the left and the realists do is they say, well, let me qualify that. The left says, they're obviously lying, right? So therefore, what are they secretly hiding? Well, it's capitalist, business motives. And so actually the left is half correct in as much as the actual strategy is different from the stated idealistic rationale, but it's usually been military. It hasn't been commercial.
So could we say that American presidents have been Straussians, even if they never heard of Strauss?
No, but actually the left is sounder on this than the realists are, because the realists take this idealistic verbiage at face value. So if you look at a lot of the realist criticism of the Bush administration, for example, they'll take the statements about democratizing Iraq and freedom everywhere and so on, and then they will attack the Bush administration as though this verbal rationale for the Iraq War was the actual reason for the Iraq War, and that this proves the utopianism of American political culture, when all they're doing is they're just sort of jumping up and down furiously on, public talking points without actually criticizing the strategy.
All right, well, let's okay. So your argument is that presidents operate on a motive different than what they say publicly. Is that in this case?
Well, sometimes they're quite honest about it. In the case of World War I and World War II, they were not lying. I mean, they came out and they said, we can't allow Germany to control the North Atlantic. We can't allow Hitler to dominate Europe and Japan to dominate East Asia. But it is true in the Cold War, for example, that there's a gap between the rhetoric and the reality. Even when I think the strategies were right, for example, I think in general the containment strategy was right. It required us to be willing to go to war if necessary to defend South Korea and South Vietnam, and also Taiwan and and West Berlin against Soviet-sponsored attacks. The reason we went to war was to defend our credibility, so that our more important allies like Japan and West Germany would not lose confidence in us as their protector. Now, can you find things where Harry Truman is saying, it's freedom versus dictatorship, or Lyndon Johnson is saying, well, if we don't stop them in Vietnam, they'll be in Hawaii and then in California? Well, of course. But you have to be careful that you don't mistake the public rationale for the actual strategic rationale.
So where does this leave George W. Bush in the Iraq War? I mean, certainly, you seem to be saying earlier that the reasons he said for invading Iraq aren't the reasons we actually invaded, if I heard you right.
I'm not the only one who says it. Paul Wolfowitz said this in his Vanity Fair interview with Sam Tannenhouse. He said bringing freedom to the Iraqi people would not have justified it putting American soldiers in harm's way. And this was even after the war had begun. No. Clearly, the Iraq War was supported by different groups for different motives. I take the neoconservative grand strategy of U.S. global hegemony seriously in my book. I think it's a strategy. It is a security strategy. It's a consistent theory of providing for American safety, and I think the neoconservatives who devised it have been quite sincere. I think they're mistaken, but nevertheless I take them seriously. And the strategy, as I said before, is one in which the United States, by providing the public good of security for all of the other great powers, will prevent them from rearming and opposing us at some point in the future. So essentially the U.S., by being the top rooster in the barnyard, creates order in peace, because as long as the other chickens know their place in the pecking order, there's not going to be some great battle to be top rooster. And that's their analysis. If you read a lot of the neoconservative literature, it's that the world wars came about because Britain declined, and there was this battle of succession for Britain. And that's why they're obsessed with having the U.S., outspend all other great powers combined, in the military. Now, I think it's based on a mistaken theory of history, but I think it's a sincere strategy.
So did we invade Iraq then to prove our number oneness in the world?
No, I think we invaded Iraq to consolidate our military hegemony in the Middle East by having bases there. I think to this day, as far as I can tell from the press, we're continuing to pour concrete for gigantic U.S. military bases in Iraq. It wasn't for their oil. I mean, you can get the oil, other ways. But once Al-Qaeda had used the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia as a rallying cry, we needed to have a presence there, a permanent military presence. And I think the neocons will find out when this is declassified, down the road. But they thought that Iraq, secular population, so they thought if you read what they wrote back then, before the war, fairly educated population. It would be sort of like Lebanon. It would be the most likely to succeed in becoming a sort of secular Western-type society. You would have Chalabi or someone else, would be imposed to replace Saddam, who would go like Noriega did. It wouldn't be a prolonged battle. And then it would be the South Korea. It would of the Middle East. It would be to our presence in the Middle East for decades to come what South Korea has been. In Okinawa. So I think the bases are the major factor. And the weapons of mass destruction, and then later on, because they really only pushed the democratization thing after the war. I think, these are pretexts. I mean, it's like, Christianizing the Filipinos. The goal was to install a pro-American ruler in Baghdad who would sign away permanent military bases to us. Now, what that would do is, it would cement our fairly unstable recent position as the military hegemon of the Persian Gulf, which doesn't go back all that far. It goes back, really to the Gulf War. Because before that, you had the Soviet-American battle, and before that, you had the British and the French were the major forces in the region. Now, how does this help the neoconservative strategy of global dominance? Well, the other potential peer competitors, the other potential great power rivals, particularly China, are much more dependent on Persian Gulf oil than the United States is. So we're not there to defend our oil.
We're there to keep it from them.
Well, we're defending the oil of China and Japan, and to a lesser extent of Europe. The power to defend is the power to threaten. So, and I say this as a patriot, but our strategy is essentially that of, the local mafioso who goes to the store and says, I'm going to volunteer to protect your truck shipments. It's like, oh, no, you don't have to hire security guards. We'll provide them for free. So something might happen, who knows?
So you say that the neocons were mistaken in their policy in general, in terms of the worldwide American umbrella, if you will.
Yeah, I think they're sincere, but I think they're mistaken because they're much too pessimistic about world politics. And I say this as someone who was a Cold War hawk, but their analysis of world politics, actually it's very similar to the realists, even though there's all this bad blood between them. Because the realists explain World War I and the subsequent conflicts as the inevitable result of the existence of multiple great powers with a rough equality of power. So if they coexist and they have the same amount of power, inevitably there are going to be world wars. Now, that's not to me what the history of the 20th century says. To me, the history of the 20th century is great power conflict is not inevitable unless one or more of the great powers is aggressive. There would not have been a World War I if Imperial Germany had not been looking for excuses going back to the early 1900s to cripple Russia and France before they became too powerful and to create a European empire, because the Imperial Germany quite rightly concluded that unified Germany, post-1870 Germany, was too small to be a global superpower, that they would be dwarfed by Russia and the United States in the 20th century. Well, what was the solution? Conquer Europe, create a bigger Germany, or German empire. That was Hitler's logic too, although in the case of Hitler, it's unclear whether he thought in terms of a global balance of power or of ultimately, one Aryan world empire. The Cold War, that was not the result of the inevitable tragic nature of international relations. It was Stalin's aggression. If Stalin had pulled the Red Army out of Europe, allowed them to have their own elections, the U.S. would have quite willingly gone along with a cordon sanitaire where, the Poles, the Germans, the countries along Russia's border were forbidden to have, various kinds of weapons, just as Germany and Japan are today. So in my view, German aggression and Soviet aggression were the causes of the Cold War. Now that makes you optimistic. Because if, in fact, you have a world of great powers, even if it becomes a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world, that's not necessarily a recipe for world war unless one of them wants to murder one or more of the others.
Okay. Well, that's a fair point. So your argument is that this concert of nations could succeed, and every now and then they have to just squelch somebody who's a bad egg, if you will, like Kaiser or Hitler or Stalin. Is that
Well, that's right. Now, in the event that one or more of the great powers that belong to the great power concert actually does become aggressive, and they can become aggressive by means other than conquering their neighbors, by building up arms, by using arms to intimidate their neighbors into diplomatic concessions. Well, look, the other members of the concert then have a ready-made alliance.
Okay, and that's your argument about that's the American way is to do it that way, as you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. So Plan A is a great power concert.
Right.
Plan B is a great power alliance against an aggressor.
Okay, let's take two countries that are seen by many Americans as having aggressive intentions toward the world, toward our allies, and toward the United States. And those two countries are Iran and China. How would you apply your book, and we should mention this again, American Way of Strategy, to those two countries?
Well, Iran's not a great power. It might be down the road, but it's a purely regional power. It's a dangerous regional power. It's now in the latter stages of a revolution. And what you find historically is that realists make a useful distinction between status quo powers and revisionist powers. And you can add a third category, revolutionary powers, who are spreading, Maoist communism or, Shia Islam or something like that, Islamism. What you see in these countries, whether it's Jacobin France, whether it's Soviet Russia, whether it's Maoist China, or revolutionary Islamist Iran, it takes about a generation from the time of the revolution for the revolutionary fervor to die out. Sooner or later it does. Sooner or later, the population is exhausted. There's a backlash against the Jacobin ideologues or, the radical communists or the mullahs. There's some evidence of a backlash already taking place in Iran. But until that thermidor occurs, the revolutionary regime is kind of radioactive, and it's very hard to fit it into a Grotian society of states. Because, for example, Iranians refuse to play by the rules of the game, whether it's the sanctity of ambassadors, in the Carter years, or, providing, weapons to Hezbollah.
Or declaring they want to exterminate Israel, which is certainly...
Yeah, that's right. The premise of the UN Charter is that all of the states in the UN are allowed to continue to exist, and one state can't announce its intention to annihilate the other. So I do think it's the Iranian regime is the problem. Well, what's the solution? Well, Iran is not a serious military threat to its neighbors, in spite of what is said. It doesn't have the conventional power, even if it had the ambition, to conquer Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and so on. It could intimidate them, with weapons of mass destruction, but there's only so much you can do. It's kind of a bluff that can be called. If you say, well, make these concessions to us, then the question is, or what, you're going to nuke us? I mean, come on. In the case of Israel, does anyone believe that the Iranians, who claim to be champions of the Palestinians, are going to incinerate the Arabs of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza? So this is...
But actually, plenty of people say that they would view that as a small cost. I mean, are they wrong?
Oh, yeah, I think they are wrong, of course. So that would be the end of their regime. I mean, we, among other states of the world, would and should, at that point do to them what we did to the Taliban in Afghanistan. So I think you have to look, in the case of North Korea, I'll get to China in a minute, but if you look at North Korea and Iran, these are two anti-American regimes. They're of dubious popular legitimacy. They very well could fall as a result of popular discontent. When they saw the U.S. Successfully attack Iraq, not just once but twice, they had an incentive to defend themselves against American invasion for regime change, particularly with lots of neoconservatives at AI talking about this, right? Well, look, they're not stupid. They know that their Air Force would last a few hours and what they have of a Navy would be sunk in a few hours by the U.S. There's no way their conventional militaries can possibly defend them from a really all-out American assault. So therefore, they have an incentive to use the poor man's deterrent, which is weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons. Now, could we have averted this? I don't know. They might have tried to get nuclear weapons for prestige reasons. In the case of Iran, which was invaded and attacked at great cost by Iraq when we were supporting Iraq and de facto, they're as worried about their neighbors maybe as they are about us. I do think we could have offered both of these regimes a deal, where of the kind that we offered the Soviet Union in the Helsinki Treaty of the mid-1970s, where we said, we're not going to try to overthrow your regime by force. If your people do, we will applaud, but we're not going to do it. And also, we will respect the sanctity of borders. Borders will not be changed by force. And in the case of the Korean Peninsula, again, the caveat there is, if in 20 years, the post-communist North Koreans decide to merge with the South Koreans, that's not changing it by force, but we're not going to do it. Would that have made a difference? I don't know.
Okay, but what would you do now about Iran?
Well, prospectively with Iran, because I think the North Korean thing is reasonably under control. Essentially, we're the bad cop, China's the good cop, and even though people in Washington complain about that, it's not a bad system for ameliorating that situation. In the case of Iran, I think we have to have a balance of power policy. As I write in the American Way of Strategy, the situation in the Middle East does not permit a concert of powers. There are just too many divisions. Most of Israel's neighbors don't recognize it. There's this radical regime in Tehran. There's chaos where you have the decomposition of these post-colonial states, both Lebanon and Iraq. They're disintegrating, into ethnic militias. So it's a chaotic situation. The most we can do, and it would be an improvement over what we're doing now, is to go back to our Reagan-era policy. I actually think that Ronald Reagan got it right and George W. Bush and the Neocons got it wrong. We pursued a balance of power policy in the Middle East, in the 1980s, strengthening Iraq against Iran. Now that we've destroyed Iraq, it can no longer act as a counterbalance against Iran. So I think the U.S. inevitably, even if you think we should get out of Iraq, even if you think in the long run we should lower our presence in the Middle East, at this point, there being no regional counter to Iran anymore, I do think we need to beef up our deterrent presence, maybe our naval presence as we've been doing. I think that's prudent.
Okay. But I oppose an attack on Iran.
Yes, I think. Well, look, again, I'm a liberal internationalist, at least in the old-fashioned sense. Under the UN Charter, there are only two circumstances in which you're permitted to go to war with another country. First, self-defense, which can include collective self-defense. I mean, so we can go to war on behalf of a weak country that's attacked by Iran, but not in the absence of that. Or a Security Council resolution, because as I read the UN Charter, the Security Council can do whatever it wants, if the great powers agree. But in the absence of an attack on another country by Iran and a Security Council authorization, which isn't just a legalistic thing, it means essentially that all the great powers of the world are on the same side as you are. The U.S. cannot legally attack Iran. That is a violation of the legal system that we, the United States, constructed after World War II. Now, the Bush administration is trying to dismantle it, with the assistance, I should say, of those Democrats who support a concert of democracies theory, where we strip away sovereignty from non-democratic states. If we want to basically tear up this international system from after 1945, let's have a debate about it. But let's not do it without a debate.
Fair enough. We're going to have to draw to close in a few minutes.
Well, let me address the China question.
Well, yeah, please, China, exactly.
China could become a very, very dangerous threat to its neighbors in the United States in the future. It is not now. It is concentrating on developing its economy. It is supporting international organizations, in some cases doing so very shrewdly, for example, promoting Asia-only trade organizations that exclude the U.S., but that's commercial diplomacy, that's the French do the same thing. I mean, the EU does the same thing. They're modernizing their military, which is what you would expect as a poor country develops. So to assume, again, on the basis of this flawed reading of 20th century history that all great powers inevitably become enemies of each other, I think would be a terrible mistake. At the same time, it would be a terrible mistake to assume that we're always going to get along with China, which is why I propose in the American Way of Strategy that we take part in an East Asian concert of powers. So in other words, instead of trying to encircle China through alliances with Japan and India and South Korea, some of the neoconservatives want. We say, okay, let's have a collective security Asian organization. We belong to it. Japan does. Russia does. China, maybe South Korea. If China becomes aggressive, then we fall back on an anti-Chinese alliance. But if it doesn't, then we have a stable, permanent, great power security system in East Asia.
Would it be like NATO or something?
It would be like NATO without an enemy. I think we should convert NATO into a pan-European collective security organization by either admitting Russia or by beefing up the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which at this point is a paper organization, but it has the benefit of including Russia.
But of course, when I said NATO, I almost caught myself because NATO involves lots of troop movements and interoperability and so on. Are you talking about that?
Well, there are two NATOs. NATO was a treaty before it was an organization. Initially it was a treaty. So that the U.S. would be committed to the defense of Britain and France and the other countries against a resurgent Germany as well as the Soviet Union. Then with the Korean War, it became a very militarized sort of organization because we stationed all of these troops there. But you can have a treaty as the basis of a regional concert of power system. And sure, there would be interoperability, of the militaries. There would be joint exercises, but we're kind of doing that already. We've had joint exercises in the past year with both the Japanese and the Chinese. So we're kind of moving towards that anyway. I would just make it formal.
How would you apply? We'll wrap up in a second. How would you apply your thinking on American foreign policy to sort of what we'll call new issues like human rights, and environmental protection, especially global warming? I mean, these are areas that, at least by my reckoning, don't have a lot of precedent in terms of past the American experience, or am I wrong?
Look, the great powers, we live in a very hierarchical, unequal world, and so if I sound like a great power chauvinist, that's just the nature of the world. The G8 countries, plus China and soon India, will have the overwhelming majority of the world's wealth and power. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you want some horrible, tyrannical fourth world regime to treat its people better, then if all of its trading partners impose sanctions against it, that can be successful. It means that if you want to solve global warming by reducing carbon emissions, you don't have to get the nearly 200 members of the General Assembly to agree to a treaty. All you need to do is get the U.S. and the EU to agree, and maybe China and India. That's essentially 4 economic entities, and you've solved the problem. I think that liberal internationalists make a terrible mistake when they think that the way to pursue their goals is to include as many countries as possible. The fact is that the more countries you include, the more difficult it is to reach a consensus. And a lot of these non-traditional issues, why shouldn't they be addressed? Getting rid of female genital mutilation, and persecution of homosexuals, and censorship of the internet. Fine. It just seems to me the practical way to do that, if you have most or all of the great powers agree on it, it will happen.
So a president would have to lead, or whoever would have to lead a group and say, listen, we're coming here to talk about this issue, and we're going to, as I say here in town, work the problem in a certain way to get an outcome. And you're not really going to worry about getting 200 countries involved, you're going to worry about getting 10 countries involved. I
think so. I think if you want to address global environmental issues, you want to get China and India and Germany and a few other countries on your side, Japan. If you want to invite Liechtenstein along, that's all right, or Monaco. But, why are you wasting your time?
Don't forget Poland.
Don't forget Poland.
Michael Lind, this has been extremely interesting. Thank you again for telling us about your book, The American Way of Strategy.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to flog it on what may be called the flogosphere from now on.
So thank you very much again.
Thanks.